Hey, good people. It's Dr. G, host of T.S.O.B with Dr. G, and I've got a question for you. Have you become a T.S.O.B insider yet? I know you're probably like, what is that? But let me tell you, in addition to this podcast, we have got a bunch of wonderful things on the way special events, partnerships, classes, lots of different things that are coming up that we want to provide to those who are really on the TSOB team. And the only way to get on that team is to join the listserv. So when you get a chance, head over to www.subscribepage.com/TSOB. And when you do that, you will be in the know. We won't spam you, I promise, but you will be first to find out about different events, like I said, that we've got coming up, as well as special discount codes that will come for all the other particular projects that we're doing. So again, www.subscribepage.com/TSOB so you can become an insider, and we will look forward to seeing you there. Now, let's start the show. Welcome to TSOB with Dr. G, a podcast featuring intellectual table talk about race and sexuality. I'm your host, Dr. Tracy Q. Gilbert, a sexuality educator, writer, and researcher. Join me as I talk with the most brilliant minds in human sexuality, applying a professional Black lens to discussions about sexiness, health, and healing in the new millennium. It's TSOB, the sex ed of Black folk. Let's get to the get down, shall we? Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode. Y'all know, every time I start the episode, I say I'm excited. And this episode is no different because I'm talking to amazing people. Today, I get to talk to David Wraith, and I'm super excited about that because, one, I just think the profession of sex ed is just loaded with so many awesome, amazing, dope people. And I also love it when I'm able to talk to folks who are masculine identified in our profession, because that is also kind of a few and far between, and we'll get into that maybe a little bit. But I had the pleasure of meeting David. Maybe what?
2019?
Maybe it was 2019 because I met you at the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Summit as I was presenting on my research on racialization and the effects of race on Black folks experiencing their sexuality. And ever since then, I've been following what you do, and we've been able to connect, and so I'm just really happy to have you in this space. I'm going to give him a chance to talk about himself. He gave me the shortest bio, and I'm like, I don't know if that's because if that's a man thing or not. I don't know. I try not to assign things based on gender, but I was like, it's real funny to me that this is literally one sentence. So I'm going to say the one sentence, and then I'm going to get into it with David. So David Wraith is a writer, activist, sex educator, and co-founder of Sex Positive St. Louis. Thank you. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you for having me. I'm
happy you're here. I will also say, while we met at a Sexual Freedom Summit, one of the reasons I also wanted you on the show is because I heard you on a podcast called Let's Talk, Bruh. And you were talking, and that if you have a chance to follow that show, I'm not sure if they're doing new episodes, but I know I was listening and I heard the episode that you were on where you were talking about some of the work you do. And I was just like, I got to have you on my first season of this show because I just felt like you were saying some really profound things. So why don't you go ahead and tell the people a little bit about yourself? But I'm going to do it the way I do it with all of my guests. So I'm going to give you my top 3 questions and then we'll go from there. So my top 3 questions: where you from? Where your people from? And what's got you thinking about sex and sexuality these days?
Okay, where am I from? I'm born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri. My people are from the South, so like Tennessee, Mississippi.
Yeah.
Currently, most of my family, I would say, is in Chicago and Memphis. My family is outside of St. Louis. Um, and what has me thinking about sex and sexuality right now? Oh man, honestly, it's been a struggle to think about sex and sexuality in COVID world
Yeah.
because I'm I work at a sex health agency, and we do intake on people. We have a survey that we have people fill out before we like test them for different sexually transmitted infections.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the questions that we ask is, how many sex partners have you had in the last year? How many sex partners have you had? How many new sex partners have you had in the last 2 months? And I self-identify as a free-range poly man whore. Like I'm
Love
out
that.
there. Like no shame in the game. I'm out there. But COVID has me basically
Yeah.
monogamous. Like I'm not seeing almost any of my outside of my fiance. I've not seen most of my regular sex partners, and I have not taken on any new sex partners since the
Yeah.
epidemic. And sometimes people come in, and no shame. I don't slut shame. I don't judge anybody. But I see people come in and they're filling out their survey, and they've had so many new sex partners. And we ask them how often they use condoms or barrier methods, and sometimes they'll say, I've had so many new sex partners in the last 2 months, and I use condoms 0% of the time. And I'm just shocked that people are out
They're real
here
free.
throw, throwing up LeBron numbers in the middle of a global pandemic.
Yeah.
And normally, and I like I said, I don't judge, but like internally, like mentally, sometimes people will come in and they've had so many new sex partners, and pre-COVID, in my brain, I'm thinking, okay, go ahead on, live your best life. And now I'm like, what are you
Yeah.
doing?
Yeah.
So I guess the thing that I'm thinking about right now with regard to sex and sexuality is how do we have sex during the global pandemic, and what's it going to be like when this is over?
Mm-hmm.
Because I've already gone on record a few times on social media saying, you know what, when this pandemic is over, I'm fucking everybody,
It's a free flow. It's a free for all.
get ready, it's gonna be the roaring 20s for real, for real. Because like I normally in a given year, I normally throw like two or three really big parties.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Typically, now I personally don't typically throw sex parties. I've done it, but it's really not my thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I throw clothing optional parties,
Okay.
and I throw what are called CF&M parties, which is clothed female, naked male. So I throw parties where all the women are fully clothed and all the men are butt naked.
Mm-hmm.
And I for me personally, I'm not huge on sex parties myself, although they're fine. But I like to throw parties that are very sexy where people can meet and mingle. And the biggest compliment for me is when I found out that, somebody met at one of my parties and they went home and hooked up, or they started dating, couples met at one of my parties.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always great.
Yeah.
And you know, part of me's been really happy to have this break because, each party takes like 6 weeks to a month to put together, and it's a lot of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a way, it's been nice to just have a year off. But also, like, I'm really looking forward to like throwing parties and going to parties again. So,
Yeah.
a lot of what I'm thinking about with sex and sexualities right now is like, oh man, this is a really good idea. Oh, ooh, can't do that. Global pandemic.
Right.
Okay, write it down.
Right. It's a global pandemic, right? Or as some of the different comedians call it, the panorama, right? The panini,
The
all the different
panorama.
words. Yes. Um,
Yeah.
wow. So there's so many different juicy bits that you just raised, and I'm like, ooh, let's get into that. However, as someone whose people are also from Tennessee, I have to ask you questions because you were like, especially coming from St. Louis and right up that corridor, I-55, I-94. Where in Tennessee are your people from?
Memphis.
Okay. So my people are from Ripley, which is
Okay.
right up north. And so I have lots of family in Memphis. And so I was like, wait a minute, let me find out we were related or somewhere along the way. That there's some type of overlap there. That's why I asked that question, because it's like there are so many connections that we all have to the South. And I think they also play a part in how we come to understand sexuality too, which we don't have to get into that. But I'm just thinking of that, like,
But we can. The South is big in kink because there's a whole in good ways and bad.
Yeah.
Don't get it twisted. But yeah, like as coming from the BDSM world, like yeah,
Yeah.
like
So
you
let's
know,
talk. Okay, so I feel like we're gonna get there eventually, talking about BDSM, talking about kink, and all those juicy things. I want to find out first from you, how did you even get into sex ed, particularly from your lived experience as a man, as you know, from that background.
So I had a very sex positive upbringing. Although my mother, my late mother, I don't think the word sex positive would resonate with her at all. And I know the word feminism didn't resonate because I asked my mother, "Are you a feminist?" And she said, "Absolutely not." But my mother, who was very conservative in a lot of ways, was also very sex positive in ways that I don't know that she was fully aware of. And so I was the youngest of five kids. I have three sisters and a brother, but I grew up with two older sisters. My parents divorced when I was five, and my grandmother lived next door. So it was me, two older sisters, my mom, and my grandmother. And like when my sisters would be talking about things like puberty and their periods and getting on birth control, as a kid, I would always be like, "Wow, look at the time. I'm gonna head out." And my mom would say, "No, you're gonna sit here and you're gonna listen to this." And so, because my mom was a nurse, and my one of my sisters, she's a social worker and she worked for Planned Parenthood. So they wouldn't describe our household as sex positive, but I would. And I'm Gen X. I'm 47. I just turned
Hey,
47.
yes.
So I'm part of this generation that, for I think a lot of us, those people my age, we are old enough to remember a world pre-HIV, but a lot of us were not sexually active in a world pre-HIV. So the generation behind us, they've never experienced a world without HIV. Our parents' generation didn't really take it seriously, in my opinion, because most of them were married and had kids before the epidemic. Whereas we had this transition of we remember before HIV, but we came of age sexually during a epidemic. And that's what really got me interested in sexual education was, again, like, how do you have sex during a pandemic? And so when I was 18 years old, when I graduated high school, I joined ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. I was the youngest member in the St. Louis chapter, and as far as I know, the only heterosexual member of the St. Louis chapter. But it was really getting started with AIDS activism at 18 years old was really my entrance into sex ed. And from ACT UP, I joined an organization called the St. Louis Effort for
Yeah.
AIDS. From St. Louis Effort for AIDS, I joined Food Outreach, where I was actually delivering food to people living with HIV. So this is all like undergrad, 18, 19, 20 years old. So from a very early age, I was involved with sex ed, but it was from a very, in my opinion, reactionary point of view. It's, oh, there's a pandemic, we have to stop it. And then once the Bush administration started in 2000, I started working with Planned Parenthood and NARAL, National Abortion Rights Action League. So again, it was this very reactionary. What do we do about unplanned pregnancy? What do we do about this Republican administration that's restricting access? And so I got to a point where I realized that I was devoting my life to, sex ed and sex activism, but it was all addressing the negatives, not accentuating the positives, to coin a phrase. And so that evolution went from we're fighting HIV, we're fighting unwanted pregnancy, we're fighting attacks on abortion rights to instead of fighting against, what are we fighting for? What about pleasure? What about sexual liberation? So
Yeah.
that's been my evolution over the past 20 or so years.
Yes, yes. I love that so much. Yeah. Can you I'm just trying to imagine it, and I identify as being part of Gen X, but I'm very much at the tail end. I'm 41. So, um based on what I understand about that movement, or and that it, HIV at the time was absolutely affecting Black and Brown poor folks, but that the main faces, particularly of organizations like ACT UP, that they were white. And so I'm curious about your experience as a Black man during that time, if race played a part at all in your experiences, as someone who was serving the community and even just someone who was part of the movement.
Well, part of my evolution was that I was not very uncomfortable. I was somewhat uncomfortable with ACT UP. And that's not a judgment. But as a black person and as a heterosexual person, I was as a double minority within the minority that was ACT
Yeah.
UP. And ACT UP was very confrontational And I wasn't as comfortable with that. I mean, now with Black Lives Matter, I'm more comfortable with confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
So part of my reasons for leaving ACT UP was I wanted something that was less political and more service oriented. And by the time I got to food outreach, all my clients were Black.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really not until I got to food outreach that I realized how, Black queer men were being devastated by HIV at a much higher rate
Mm-hmm.
than white queer men. And so getting to, going from being in an organization that was primarily political and mostly white to being in a position where I was doing more service, and all the people I was serving were, Black folks like me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was much more comfortable in that role. Um, I wasn't super conscious of any like discrimination in those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
I was very Pollyannish about race until, maybe 15 years ago, to be 100% honest with you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I was kind of naive in a lot of those spaces where now I would probably be more aware of, the way that white supremacy infiltrates, activist spaces, even when you're dealing with primarily marginalized people
Yeah.
who happen to be white.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying that because I think some of that, and you can correct me if that's not your experience. I also feel like some of that was a product of being in the Midwest because I feel like I have that same story of prior to maybe 2004. I was very clear that race was a thing, racism was a thing, but I was also of the mindset of like, listen, if you just think positive, if you just, surround yourself with positive people, like I used to remember telling students that I worked with at the time, if you fight every time someone calls you the N word, you'll be fighting for the rest of your life. So you just need to focus on your, building yourself up and all these things. And I think there was kind of this attitude of like, we can love ourselves through this very clear racism that was permeating everything that we're living through.
I think with me, my naivete was really about activist spaces and marginalized people.
Mm, mm-hmm,
I was very lyric because St. Louis is a very racially polarized
mm-hmm,
city,
absolutely.
and Missouri is a very conservative state.
Mm-hmm,
But I felt like, okay, straight white cisgender men, yeah, you got to be, on your toes around them. But if a white man is gay or bi or HIV positive or a white trans person, like they're fine because they're marginalized and they get it.
mm-hmm.
And it was a rude awakening.
Yeah,
I
great
was
point.
I was dating a young woman. This was back in like '94,
Mm-hmm,
and she had a best friend who she was bisexual. She had a best friend who was a white woman who was HIV positive and married to a Black guy.
mm-hmm.
And I was like, and we would hang out, and then I found out that this white woman was like mad homophobic. And my little 19, 20-year-old brain couldn't compute that this woman was in an interracial relationship.
Mm-hmm.
She was HIV positive herself, but she was homophobic.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I really had to realize that marginalized people can be bigots.
Absolutely, absolutely. Having a margin in one area does not take you off the hook for practicing oppression in another. Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so tell me, you talked about your journey leading up to Sex Positive St. Louis. Tell me how you got there and what that does now.
Okay, so yeah, I was really sort of like trying to find a lane for like a decade as far as my activism. Like I said, I went from, Planned Parenthood, NARAL, Planned Parenthood. I was doing like safer sex demos and like lesbian bars. That did not go over well. Um,
I'm sure. I'm sure
because
it
I would
did.
I would go anywhere. I would just show up anywhere. Didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so in 2010, there was a woman in St. Louis, my really good friend Kendra Holiday. She had a blog called The Beautiful Kind.
Mm-hmm.
That was a sexuality blog, and I was like, okay, I need to meet this person. We need to hook up. So I started networking and in that community and became friends with Kendra. And then another young woman, Anna Bent, young black bisexual woman, had this idea for Sex Positive St. Louis. She recruited Kendra, and Kendra recruited me, and it was just like this is perfect. This is exactly what I've been wanting to do for the past 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
but just haven't had a team and couldn't do it myself. And so we started out primarily online. We started out as a blog, and we were having like in-person events kind of to promote the blog. And over time it kind of, and we had a national following. Like I went to Boston in like 2011 or 2012, and like literally like I got off a plane in a city where I knew no one and people knew me from the Sex Positive St. Louis blog, which is weird because it's Sex Positive St. Louis and people
You
knew us all over the
famous.
country. um but as our local membership grew, we kind of switched our focus from online to in person. And so we started throwing a lot more events. So we were pre-COVID, we were having like sex education events every month and private parties and happy hours, and really just trying to create a space for adult sex ed and socialization in an environment where you could talk about sex, like, you know, things that you might not say to someone that you just met at a bar for fear of looking, seeming really creepy. You could have that conversation at our events, usually because everyone there is sort of self-identified as being sex positive, and especially our educational events because we're kind of breaking the ice for you with whatever topic we're covering. It's a lot easier to talk about polyamory or BDSM or nudism or whatever if you're at an educational event around that topic and
Right.
everyone is there for that. So really, we want to educate people and we want to connect people around sex positivity.
Yeah, I love that. I love that so, so much. So then related to that, let me move into my next question. If you had to, define it, what would you say your sex ed superpower is?
My sex ed superpower. I have a few.
Hey, break them down.
uh,
Talk your
I
shit.
mean,
It's cool.
I feel like my fields of expertise, for lack of my fields of experience, I should say, are polyamory, nudism and body acceptance, and BDSM. And because these are topics that I have not just researched, but this has been my life,
Yeah.
my whole adult
Yeah, yeah,
life.
yeah.
Really my whole life. Like I've always been this guy, even when I wasn't really old enough to practice it.
Uh-huh. Were you the one who would as a toddler would run out streaking during Thanksgiving and doing those sorts of things?
No, no, no. I never did that. I was actually worse. I was the kid who would expose himself on the baseball field. Like,
Oh
if I was
no.
if I was in the outfield and somebody hit a pop fly, I would just like pull my pants down where everybody's eyes were on the ball. And
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow. So
oh,
that actually brings me to something that you were saying in when you were first talking about what you're thinking about related to sexuality, where I was like, I want to dig more into this. You were talking about how your parties are not sex parties, but they're parties that, where people can be naked and they can, explore that. Talk a little bit more about that, especially for the people who may think, how is that not a sex party?
well, it's not a sex party in the sense that people aren't having sex on the premises.
Okay.
And to be fair, well, to be totally honest, I have some trauma from childhood around people having sex in front of me without my consent.
Gotcha.
And I didn't realize it until Sex Positive St. Louis threw our first sex demo, and my late wife, my wife at the time, uh, like my wife turned to speak to me, and I literally had my shirt pulled over my head rather than watch people having sex in front of me.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot about myself in that process. Um, and so they're not. We have parties where people can have sex, but usually they're not the ones that I personally organize. And I did an interview with the newspaper a while ago, and it got quoted in a book on, I can't remember the title, a book on nudism, of talking about the fact that, there are people who say that, nudism is all about sex. And then there are people that say, people in the nudist community say nudism is not about sex at all. And it's like, you're both kind of full of shit. Like, like people say that nudism is all about sex. It's not. If I just want to passively look at naked people for my own titillation, I can watch porn. I can go to a strip club and look at professional naked people and
Right.
be safe and not have to be vulnerable and take my clothes off myself or
Right.
even feel like that expectation is there. But also people that say it's absolutely not about sex, come on. Like, coming from the fetish community, anything can be about sex. If
That's true.
leather can be about sex, if high heel shoes can be about sex, then being surrounded by naked bodies can certainly be sexual, even if we are not having sex. And that's okay, and that's fine. That's human. I feel like whether it's the nudist community and even to some extent the gay community, which I mean I can't speak for as a straight person, but there is this attitude that we have to desexualize who we are to be accepted in the mainstream or to be seen as safe. And heterosexual straight cisgender people, they don't feel like, who are in the mainstream in their sexuality, they don't feel like they have to desexualize themselves. It's only people that are marginalized for their sexuality feel like, okay, we have to let the world know that what we're doing
It's
is
normal. We're
not
just
about
like everyone
sex,
else.
you know
Yeah, yeah,
and it's not all about sex, but it's not about
yeah.
sex. And so I don't know if that illuminates that
Well,
question
I
at
think it
all.
does. I think something else that I think about, and I'd love to hear if this is resonant for you, where people, what's coming up in my mind is the idea of it can be about sex, but it doesn't have to be. Right. So I think about, especially when we talk about nudity in children and like people who have their children maybe not wearing clothes in different spaces and avenues, and the sexualization of children, and recognizing like, no, that it doesn't have to be that. Like, I also think about chest feeding and people who feed in public, and the ways that people try to sexualize that. And it's like, well, that person, the baby's eating, right? Like, in the same way you don't eat with a cover on your head, this child should not have to eat on your head, over your head.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that's resonant for you, but that's something I also think about with the idea of nudity. And
Well, I think it's we're terrified of sex and we're terrified of our own bodies.
well,
There's no other
can't
explanation
deny
for
that.
why
Yeah.
public chest feeding is controversial. I mean, what does someone feeding their child have to do with you? And why is the commercial sexualization of female bodies or assigned female at birth bodies okay, but someone nourishing their child is offensive?
Right.
And often for the same person, especially straight men. So I think it's fear and also a desire for control, a desire to control people's behavior and to make other people's behavior about
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, yeah. Like, it's like, okay, this had nothing to do with you and you chose to insert yourself into it, versus maybe even doing your own processing. Like, if it's making you uncomfortable, go do your own processing versus trying to change whatever it is that you're looking at. Yeah. So I'm curious, as you've evolved in this new area of expertise, not new, but just this kind of evolved area of expertise for you, what do you feel like you come up against in terms of things that you feel like Black folks maybe get wrong about your expertise, or they may be opportunities to learn, or ways that, Blackness intersects with your area of expertise?
Well, I feel like Black people, as a on balance, we are very conservative in areas that aren't specifically tied to race. Like we can be very politically liberal and very progressive when it comes to, economic issues and racial justice issues and things that particularly affect us as Black people. But when it comes specifically to things like sexuality, we can just be mad conservative at the same time. And so I see a lot of pushback from the Black community. And you know what? With BDSM, I get it. Totally get it. With polyamory, and Black people tend to be pretty, in my experience, pretty cool about body image. Black people, I think, more so than other races, particularly white
Well,
people,
break that
tend
down
to
for
have
me,
a
because I would be surprised. I'm surprised about that idea. I'm not saying I disagree, but I'd love to hear your perspective more on that.
well, I mean, I feel like culturally, I mean, Black people body shame. Like, I'm not gonna say that we're super evolved, but I think much more so than white people, a wider range of body types are accepted in the Black community. You know, we all about the thickness and
Yes,
all that
yes,
good
yes,
stuff.
yes.
Uh, so it's not perfect, but I do think it's better. It's something that I see less in the Black community than in the white community.
Gotcha.
When it comes to polyamory, Black people can be mad conservative and downright hostile. Um, and there's this weird, and this is something that's kind of universal across races, I think, but there's this weird acceptance of, cheating and the devil versus the devil you don't. So there's a whole culture around, you think about that TLC song Creep, and I'm showing my age, but you can make a whole
I was gonna say
You
I'm
could make a
showing my age
whole,
because I was thinking Shirley Murdoch as we lay.
oh wow,
I'm going back.
it's going way back. But you could make a whole Spotify
Yeah.
playlist just of like hit pop songs that celebrate cheating, and a whole other playlist about songs that are anti-cheating.
Hmm.
But there's you know outside of Prince, I don't think you can. There's not a whole lot of songs that I'm aware of that are about consensual non-monogamy,
Mm-hmm.
and so um, I think because cheating is old, and there's this sort of value in keeping secrets, I guess, because we think that keeping secrets we don't hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
Cheating is more acceptable than polyamory,
Mm-hmm.
and I see that a lot in the black community. I remember when I moved out after college, I was moving out of my mom's house, and there was the couple that was helping me move was eventually they got married. They were a couple, and my mom knew that I was dating the wife,
Mm.
and her husband is carrying my furniture. And my mom is like, David, how could you trick him like that? And I'm like, Mom, he knows. And she just couldn't wrap her head around the fact that
Right.
his wife wasn't cheating on him, that he knew I was dating his wife.
Yeah, and it's so funny to me that you say that because at the same time, I think very often about the concept of man sharing and how common that is also in our community, even though we wouldn't call that poly. We already have the infrastructures in place that support these sorts of non-traditional relationships, right? And I think about how some of my mom's siblings are people that they're auntie, they're uncle to me, but I'm very clear that their mom and my mom's mom are different, and it was just kind of understood that we're all still family. So it's just funny to me because I think you're right. I think if it's cheating, then it's okay, we can do it and whatever. But it's like we're just gonna have an open, like we're just gonna open this relationship up and we're just gonna be what we are. Then it's well, I don't know. I don't think that's a good idea. So
I think we're more afraid of the conversation and the endorsement of the behavior. It's like
mm.
it's okay as long as it's, quiet as kept.
Or
Like
as
it's
long as it
it's like
seems like you don't appreciate it or that you don't support
yeah.
it. Mm.
Yeah, similar to like being gay. It's
Great
like a
point.
lot of people will tolerate, gay people in their family and their community so long as it's an open secret,
Yeah. Ooh, that's a great
and
point. That is a great point, right? It's that and especially if we bring the church in and we talk about the whole what is it, hate the sin, love the sinner type stuff, right? It's the idea of
yeah,
like if I'm coming out condemning it, then it's okay that I'm accepting it because I'm not
yeah.
showing that I'm in support of, which is a whole other topic, but yeah, that yeah, I see that. I see that. It actually, so now I'm curious if you think it's connected at all because it makes me think of the ways that just black people as a whole, we tend to keep these barriers over airing our dirty laundry, and we tend to try to keep these codes of silence around what we talk about. And I don't know if you feel like that's related to that or if you feel like it's something else entirely.
No, I think it's all related
Okay.
because and not to be a bummer, but the same thing applies to things like sexual assault and child
Mm,
molestation, and you know all these things are going on, and I feel like it's only been perhaps in my lifetime that there's been a cultural shift that we can process these things by talking
yeah,
about them rather than protecting ourselves by keeping them a secret
that's a great point.
and putting up this veneer of, perfect, happy family when behind closed doors, you're going through a lot of trauma that you're not able to process.
Hmm.
And meanwhile, the people next door and the people down the street are going through similar trauma, but they think they're the only ones because everybody's keeping it a
That's
secret.
it. That's facts. That's actually, yes, yes, that definitely makes sense. Definitely makes sense. So speaking of that, right? Well, not speaking of trauma aspects, but speaking of kind of what happens when people are able to kind of take off the blinders and take off the veil and be able to share. Do you have stories from your experience? How, especially with Black folks, how are Black folks taking to the types of work that you do in terms of how it affects their lives, and what are they saying about coming to a sex positive St. Louis event or one of your parties?
I mean, I think the feedback that I get is that it's very liberating.
Hmm.
And again, it's this idea that they thought they were the only one who felt this way, or they thought they were the only black person who felt this way.
Hmm.
And particularly with black men who are, kinky or poly or whatever,
Yeah.
is I get a lot of emails, especially since I did that Let's Talk Bro episode.
Mm-hmm.
I get a lot of emails from brothers who are like, I didn't know there were other guys who felt like me, other heterosexual guys who felt like me, or other, masculine identified people who felt like me.
Yeah.
And that value, it's the same as, seeing yourself in movies or seeing yourself on TV. Like, representation is so important. I
Yeah.
remember I was going to all these sexuality events where I would, out of 300 people, I would be the only black
Yeah.
person.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And in 2004, I went to a convention in Chicago, and there was a black male presenter who was into kink and a submissive, and it was just like meeting Yoda. Like, oh my
Yeah.
God,
Yeah.
like there are other black men like me in the world.
Yeah.
I'm not this anomaly. So I feel like through Sex Positive St. Louis, and also I do uh, people of color meet and greets like all across the country
Mm-hmm.
at sexuality conferences, and just because when I first started doing like traveling and doing sex ed, there'd be like one black person in, my sessions
Mm-hmm.
in one session. And then I'd go to the next session, there'd be one black person, and they'd come up to me after and be like, "Where are the black people at?"
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh God, there was that one other black person that I didn't get their name. I would
Right.
put you guys together." So I decided to start doing these meet and greets. So the one black person in every individual workshop, they could all be in the same room
Yeah.
and realize that we could fill a room.
Yeah.
Like, we're the minority in this predominantly white, sexuality convention, but there's enough of us to fill a room,
Yeah.
and we could have gone through this whole weekend and not met
And
each
not
other and
known.
exchanged information.
Absolutely.
So just bringing black people into the same room who have similar attitudes about sex and sexuality, I think and giving them a space to express it, I think it's hugely liberating, and it's just been a great way to network and meet other people and form community.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, and especially when you talk about black men, I'm glad you brought that particular angle in because, again, as I said at the beginning, I feel like, at least from a professional angle, so much of our profession seems to be femme identified, female folks, and at the same time, I'm like, I know brothers are having the conversation. I know they have this interest, and it's like, how do we get them connected in ways that feel empowering? But sometimes I feel that there's this blockage, right? Either it's homophobia of like, well, I don't want to be perceived as, whatever, or it's the sense of like potential, well, I might feel ashamed. What do if you find out what I'm interested in, if you find out what I like, is that going to make me vulnerable in ways that don't match up with the sense of masculinity I want to have? And so, what specific messages or what specific ways do you engage black men in this conversation to get them more willing to open up and be more willing to be honest about what they're interested in and what they like?
Well, I think that I try, and there's a lot of black men in St. Louis in particular, and some of whom I work with pretty closely, who we try to model a different type of masculinity.
Mm. Can you say more about that?
Just like well, I feel like in our society, vulnerability has been feminized, and so women are expected to be vulnerable, and men are not.
Mm-hmm.
And women, I think as a culture, are it's much more accepted for them to be in therapy or be in consciousness raising groups or support groups or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
whereas men, there's this myth of the Superman and the myth of the black Superman where that's soft.
Yeah.
You hard, you do this all on your own. You carry all this trauma on your back and you don't talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
you get to die. If you die without letting anyone see your true emotions, you win. And it's like, no.
Right.
Yeah, so like I've had educational events that touch on, masculinity, and I've participated in a lot of educational events on black masculinity. I've got one coming up, I think, in a week or so. And basically just trying to show a range of black masculinity. Like, it doesn't all have to be, straight heterosexual cisgender black men,
Mm-hmm.
but it can't just be queer black men, because unfortunately in our community, I think they're very easy to
Yeah.
dismiss. I think there's a lot of attitudes like, "Oh, I was going to listen to what you had to say about masculinity, but then I found out you were gay, so obviously this
Absolutely.
doesn't apply to me."
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think when straight black men gay black men, bisexual, trans men, non-binary, all get together and express just all these different ways that you can be black and masculine, and that it's okay, and that we're public and we're visible and we're out. The comment that I get the most is, you're so brave. And it's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just living my life publicly and trying not to care about what negative reaction I get.
Yeah, yeah. And I think sometimes that's a misnomer in the sense of like it's not about you being brave, but at the same time there's a certain inspiration that you provide to the folks who feel like they can't do it because they don't want to be the only one or they see themselves as being the only one. So being able to see like, oh, okay, here's an example of how I can be. Or even folks who are like, I'd love to do this, but I'm not sure how. Or I'd love to lean into this part of myself, but I'm not sure how because I don't have the model. There's some inspiration there. So it's not, I definitely hear what you're saying about, it's not about courage. It's about being, and it's just about showing up and how that makes a difference. um
Sure.
but I want to have you think about, so let's say somebody's listening and they're like, okay, David, like I hear you, I'm with it, like everything you're about, like I love it, I want to be down. I don't know how to begin to even think about making my life more sex positive or even kinky or poly or all of these things that you're so great at. What advice would you give them for getting started on their sexual journey?
Well, I mean, first of all, the internet is your friend. Like, there's when I got started in this, there was the internet was nowhere near what it is today, and social media didn't exist.
Hmm.
I was answering, ads in the back of newspapers, the classified section of
Come on,
newspapers,
newspaper is one
and
of those.
call calling people from payphones to get directions and like really sketchy stuff that in retrospect was kind of unsafe.
Hmm.
Now we have the internet, and the internet doesn't guarantee safety, but it makes it a lot easier to communicate with people and vet people before you meet them in real time.
Hmm.
There's FetLife.com, which is sort of like, Facebook for kinky people,
Hmm.
is a great way to connect with your local community. Um, there's so many like polyamory podcasts,
Hmm.
Polyamory Weekly being, I think, one of the most popular and the longest running, where you can literally, they've done, I think like 400 or 500 episodes. You can go to the Polyamory Weekly website and literally like type in a polyamory related topic and in the search bar, and it'll bring up every episode that touches on it. So first of all, it's very easy to educate yourself, privately.
Hmm.
And once the pandemic is over, I would just say find your local community and become part of it. I think one way that predators kind of one advantage that predators have is that, sexuality being so hush hush and so secret,
Hmm.
it makes it easier for them to isolate people
I would agree,
and make
absolutely.
people think that I'm this, problematic guy, because it's usually guys. I mean,
Hmm.
let's face it. I'm going to find you, and you're interested in kink, you're interested in poly. I'm going to find you, and I'm going to be your Yoda, and I'm going to teach you what kink is and what polyamory is,
Hmm.
but in this very sort of slanted way that allows me to take advantage of you because you don't know better.
Hmm.
Whereas it's harder to do that when you're part of a community where you're getting a lot of different perspectives, and people can kind of pull you aside and be like, "Hey, that
Hey.
guy I saw you talking to, I don't know."
Yeah, yeah.
So I would say if you're new, become part of a community and don't rush. Like, get to know people and let these relationships evolve organically. I feel like a lot of newbies, they're just like, "Oh, I want to be in a three-way relationship by next week," or, you know, I read a book on BDSM and now I'm a dom and I'm going to start tying people up. And
Right.
it's like,
That's not
no,
how that
like,
works.
get to know people, build relationships, find a mentor, like, ease into it. It'll be there for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
You don't have to rush.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great advice. I think that's great. And it actually makes me think of one other question that I want to pose for you. I know you spend a lot of time working with adults. And at the same time, what I know from the K 12 sphere is that there are increasing numbers of parents and folks with young folks who they're noticing are having interests, whether it's through web browser searches or through, actual activity, they're having interest in kink. And so I'm curious what advice you might give for someone who's like, hey, I got my kid seems to be interested in this and I'm not sure what to do. Like, if you have any initial ideas or any encouragement or support you'd offer for those folks.
First of all, don't panic. Like I knew I was kinky when I was 5 years old, and
Mm.
I hesitate to say that I turned out fine, but I turned out okay. I know some people would look at me and be like, "Nah, you didn't turn out fine." The second thing I would say is um, educate yourself. There's a website called Scarlet Teen, which
Mm-hmm.
is like particularly aimed toward teen, like age appropriate sex education for teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that adults can learn about how to talk to teenagers by looking at some of the material on the site.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I would say, you know, talk to your kid, and maybe don't lead with, are you into BDSM?
Right.
But, just talk to your kid about what they know about sex, how they feel about dating. Are they planning to date? Are they planning to become sexually active? My mom, on the one hand, was very good with us as kids, talking to us about sex, but then there were things that, back in, like, the late 80s, early 90s, she wasn't comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
My mom found handcuffs in my bedroom when I was like 17, and she
Okay.
and she hid them, thinking that that would force me to come to her and have this conversation. And like years later, she's like, I hid your handcuffs and you never asked me about it. And I was like, yeah, I didn't know they were gone because that wasn't my only set. So
Wow. And hopefully that doesn't freak out any of our listeners, but hopefully it also gets you to think maybe I should talk and not do passive aggressive with my child.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it would have been very easy for her to just say, "Honey, I found these handcuffs in your bedroom,"
Yeah.
and we could have had the when my father was remodeling my childhood bedroom
Mm-hmm.
when I was in high school. There was a eye hook in the windowsill behind my bed,
Mm.
which is where I would attach the restraints. And we're moving my bed because we're about to rip out the drywall,
Yeah.
and my dad goes, "Son, what is that?" And I had a rule as a kid where, so I couldn't think of a good lie in 5 seconds. I just had to tell the truth.
Right. Oh, I
And
love
I said,
that.
it had to be fast and it had to be convincing.
Right.
Otherwise, just come with the
Just
truth
tell
because
the
it's going to
truth.
come out anyway. Now I just tell the truth,
Right.
but as a teenager. And so my dad's like, "Son, what is that?" And I go, "That is where I attach the restraints when I'm tying people up before sex." And my
Well.
dad said, "Okay." And then we tore out the drywall. Uh, So yeah, if there are just like if there were signs that your kid was harming themselves
Mm-hmm.
or using drugs or any behavior that you're concerned about, just ask.
Yeah.
And I would say don't, back them into a corner and say we have to talk about this right now, but say, "Hey, I found these handcuffs in your bed. Maybe let's set a time and sit down and have a conversation," and give them time to, like, get nervous, but also think
Develop their
about how they
rap.
want to respond.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Make sure they're ready for the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. That's great. Okay, so I've got my rapid fire questions coming up in just a bit, but before we do that, I want to ask you my final kind of formal question, which is just thinking about your identity as a Black sexuality educator in this particular moment in time in history. I'd love you to share on what you feel like your role or your function or even I said legacy in another conversation and I think I kind of freaked the interviewee out, so I don't want to say legacy, but just thinking about what you feel like your purpose or your specific role is at this moment in time as a Black sexuality educator, even your significance, if you want to say that.
I feel like my significance as a Black sexuality educator, it's tied up with my significance as a heterosexual sex educator and a cisgender male sexual educator, is that I want to use my whatever privilege or authority comes from my various identities. I want to use that to reach other people like me who could use their privilege, intentionally or unintentionally, to harm other marginalized
I love
people.
that. Yeah.
I feel like it's easy to dismiss for black men, straight black men, it's easy to dismiss women. It's easy to dismiss, to a certain extent, white people. It's certainly easy to dismiss gay, lesbian, transgender, non-binary folks. Um, I feel like to the degree that it's harder for them to dismiss me because we share identity, that's really important for me to model positive behaviors for them. You can be a straight, black, heterosexual, cisgender, masculine presenting man, and it doesn't have to, and actively work to, you know, dismantle white supremacy, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia in your life and in your community.
I love that. I love that. Because I think what I also hear you saying is that you can do that and it doesn't take anything away from who you are.
No.
Yeah. I think that's so
But
important.
until we have more role models for that, I do think that a lot of straight men and straight black men in particular are just going to assume without really trying to unpack it that these behaviors towards women and queer folks and trans folks is the norm and it's okay and that it's part of being a man.
I love that. Okay. Are you ready for my rapid fire questions?
Ready as I'm ever gonna be.
Okay. And they're just sentence stems, but I'm going to give you the prompt and you're going to tell me the first thing that comes to your mind, okay?
Okay, try not to get in trouble.
Okay. Listen, you've already said a few things that I'm going to have to just put the E on. So it's all good. This is an adult show. It's fine. All right. So the first prompt is sexiness is.
Sexiness is wow, sexiness is confidence.
Love that. Yep, yep, yep. The sexiest thing about blackness and or black people is.
The sexiest thing about blackness and or black people is our ability to endure.
Come
When you
on.
can dance underwater and not get wet.
Ooh, come on with it. Come on with it. I see what you're putting down. Yes, I'm picking it up. Yes. Um, my go-to for feeling sexy is.
My go-to for feeling sexy is taking my clothes off.
Listen, I love it. It's simple. Like,
Well, my friends know if they're coming over to my house and they want me to wear clothes, they need to specify it.
I
And
love
if
that.
someone's coming in my house for the first time, I will probably ask them, "Hey, do you need me to wear clothes or
Right,
not?
is
I'm
this
fine either way,
optional?
but let me know."
Yes. I love that. I love that. Okay. Sexual freedom for black folk is achieved when.
Ooh, sexual freedom for black folk is achieved when. Ooh, God, that's tough. Uh, when we decolonize our minds and stop worrying about what white people will think of us.
Whew, come on. That last piece. Like, sometimes I think decolonization is one of those kind of loftier concepts that a lot of regular folks don't like. I mean, don't quite get. But that stop worrying about what white people think. Listen. Woo! Listen,
And
okay.
and truthfully, stop worrying about what other black people think.
Well, that's also fair. That's also fair. Fair, fair, fair. All right. Last one. When I'm done being on this podcast, I will.
When I'm done being on this podcast, I will uh probably take my clothes
I was
off.
gonna say in my head, like, is it go get naked? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I got it in my head that this was going to be audio only.
Well, you know what it
And then,
is. Like, I have been trying to say I was gonna put the video on YouTube, but honestly, I'm a one woman show right now, and so the work of doing editing video, I'm like, nah. We'll save that when I can get a full production person to make that happen. So it's just audio.
I am wearing pants though, because I was like, what if I have to like get up for
So a
any
demonstration
reason
of something.
and forget that
I get it. I get it. I appreciate that. But I would have also been okay with the negotiation prior to. All right. Thank Thank you so much for being on this show with me, David. I have had such a wonderful time. Let the people know before you head out how they can find you, how they can learn more about Positive St. Louis. I will say many of the, if not most of the references, including the Let's Talk Bruh episode, all of those links will be in the show notes. But if you want to share any other specific information about how people can find you, etc., please do.
Real quick before I go, Tracy, if I may,
Yeah.
I just want to shout you out because a big part of the reason I went to your workshop at Woodhull was you had a sign up that said this is a POC only space,
Absolutely.
and POC only was like underlined 3 times, and I was like, I didn't know you could do that because I host these POC meet and greets all across the country, and always, and I say it's for people of color and their allied guests, which basically means white people can come if they have a person of color sponsor,
Mm-hmm.
and invariably white people will come unaccompanied.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes try to contribute to the conversation. And I've never once said, wow, I'm really glad that white person just showed up at my event unaccompanied and said something. It really added.
Yeah.
So I was like, I didn't know you could do that. So I was like, okay, I'm going
Yeah.
to that. So I just wanted to shout that out.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I will say Woodhull, a shout out to Woodhull, because I do think that was a great example of allyship, because Woodhull offered that as an option to folks who were presenting if they wanted to have a POC only space. And I think that's important because to the white folks who are listening, because I know they're always here, they're always lurking, that when you think about how to hold space for Black and brown folks, it's acknowledging that sometimes we don't want to be around you. Sometimes we just need space to be by ourselves. And that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. We just need this space to ourselves. So being able to offer that is so important. So I appreciate you coming to that space. And I'm so happy to have met you through that space, because I just have been able to be connected with such an amazing mind. And again, I'm just happy that you were here. So we're all done. We will talk to y'all next week. And that's all we got. So bye, y'all.
Peace.
You've been listening to T.S.O.B. with Dr. G, produced by Dr. Tracy Q. Gilbert of Tempe, Anaya. To keep up with all things T.S.O.B., follow us on social media at T.S.O.B. the podcast, which you can find on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. For past episodes of the show, visit tsobpodcast.com or subscribe to the show either on YouTube or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Now, don't forget that you've got homework for this episode. To find the downloadable worksheet for this or any other episode of the show, head on over again to tsobpodcast.com, where you'll find it and any other important information from the show notes. And finally, do you have any questions or thoughts to share? Sound off by email at mailbox@tsobpodcast.com. Again, this was TSOB, the sex ed of Black folk. Thank you for listening. Talk again soon.